This beast of a device is Audio-gd's flagship all-in-one DAC, headphone amplifier and preamplifier, and it's so overbuilt it even has a regenerative power supply inside. So let's check it out. Previously, we looked at Audio-gd's entry-level DAC and headphone amplifier, the R2R11 Mark II. And now we're looking at completely the other end of the scale. We're looking at their big beast of an all-in-one, the R27HE. Now, the R27 itself was, well, you could say is their flagship all-in-one, where it has a DAC inside, it has a headphone amplifier, and it can act as a preamplifier as well. Now, it can be a little bit confusing because you might wonder, why would I not just buy one of these things, or why would I buy separate components like, say, one of their flagship DACs like the R8 or R7 or even R7HE, and then one of the separate headphone amplifiers, either the Master 9 or the HE version, which also has a regenerative power supply inside. So Audio-gd has long offered combined units, and it goes way back to 2009 when I suggested, why would I have to buy separate components? Why can't they be combined together? And so inside here, we more or less have an R8 R2R DAC, which is one of their flagship DACs, and also the Master 9 headphone amplifier, but also with the regenerative power supply built in. So as we're going to find out, there are some compromises to putting all things in one box. I mean, some manufacturers like Schiit Audio refused for a long time to put a DAC and a headphone amplifier inside one box. So for example, if we look inside something like an R8 or one of the flagship series components, you will see 3 transformers, and then they feed multiple different power supplies to different components inside the device. When you start putting things in one box, then you have less space for things. So whereas if you bought separates, each device would have its own transformers and power supplies. Inside the combined units, those 3 transformers, which are converting the wall power supply into lower voltages such as 15 or 20 volts for use in the amplifier or DAC circuits, they have to share those transformers. So there's a little bit of a compromise in the power supply in return. And how does this translate into sound? Well, that's what I'm going to talk about in the sound impressions. However, let's get one of the things out of the way. One of the points of the HE series components is they have a regenerative power supply. Now, as I have under my desk a PS Audio Power Plant Premier, it's an old power regenerator. Essentially, these power regenerators are a Class A amplifier, but they take the wall power and they regenerate the AC sine wave to make a perfect sine wave for the power supplies for other components. And this can have an improvement on sound quality, especially if you're living somewhere where the power supply is a little bit variable. And power supply is very critical to the sound quality of components. There's a reason why things like this have such complex power supplies in them, and it makes a big difference compared to components, say smaller components such as these topping or Singer amplifiers or the small Valley 2 and Magni, which are sitting up here. The main difference between the small components and the large components, or one of the main differences I should say, is that the power supplies in the larger and high quality components are much bigger. Now you're wondering, well, what happens when you do have components that do have to share a power supply? Well, this is maybe not the best example, but if you think about when you turn on the engine in your car and the stereo is on, the stereo will cut out while the starter motor is running. That's because the starter motor is draining all the current from the battery in one go. Now, a similar kind of thing can happen inside an electronic component such as the ones we have here, in that we have amplifier components that use higher voltages. In this case, we're talking about watts of output power, versus digital to analog converters, which will only use up to maybe about 1 volt of output, or maybe using milliamps, millivolts the whole time. So if there's any interruption or disturbance to those tiny voltages caused by other components, that's going to affect the sound quality. So that's why inside these components you will see that there are multiple power supplies where an individual power supply might provide 1 voltage to one section of the electronics, and so it is less likely to be affected by the instantaneous current draw from other components because they will have their own power supplies for that purpose. If you have one power supply that has to do all the work and provide all the voltages for the different components in there, then power draw from one section of a component will much more likely affect other components. That will affect the sound quality. And it's something that you don't see in measurements because measurements are an instantaneous snapshot of a component when it's performing at its optimum. When you actually have music playing and you have a signal that's going up and down at different frequencies, you'll actually see in a lot of lesser components the noise floor goes up and down, and that's something that a lot of manufacturers don't want you to see. And that's the reason why you have components designed in this manner. But to start with, let's take a look at some of the features of the R27HE. Let's take a look behind it and have a look at the inputs and outputs and talk about those. Now, the R27HE in many respects is similar to most kind of DACs, amps, that kind of thing, especially combined units, but there are some differences, and this one actually has been customized slightly for reasons I'll talk about just shortly. Let's start with the inputs, which are in the center section here. If I unplug this to make it a bit easier to see, we have fairly conventional inputs such as the USB, which is on its own board and fully isolated and for better sound quality. You have optical, SPDIF, and you have BNC and RCA SPDIF inputs, and these are limited to 192K. USB is up to 384K if you want to do upsampling or oversampling. And you have AES, of course, which is the same 192K limit, but you also have I2S, which has a limit of 384K, again, if you want to use upsampling and oversampling such as I do, and I have it connected to the Singza SU1 above, which you just saw. It uses a HDMI plug, and this is not a HDMI connection though, so you can't connect it to a HDMI device. It uses a different signal altogether. Now the thing about these inputs, now we talked about the USB being isolated and on its own board, but these SPDIF inputs don't just go into a regular SPDIF conversion chip such as a WM8804 or 8805, but actually go into custom programmed CPLDs, which is, and again, they are mini FPGAs. So they allow the programming of this to be changed and the sound quality improved. And one of the things about this input is it's actually not an SPDIF input. It's been customized to be a word clock input. Now, to cut a long story short, all digital signals have to have a clock, and the quality of the clock will decide the quality of the the processing of the digital signal, because if the clock is slightly off, so is the music. So this R27HE already has high quality AccuSilicon clocks, and I did try this using the word clock output of a SoundAware D300 reference, and I couldn't really notice a difference. But some people who use much higher quality dedicated clocks, like oven control clocks and all sorts of things like that, which sometimes cost thousands of dollars, have noticed a little bit of an improvement in using them. So that is an option there, and because it's firmware control, it doesn't require any major surgery to reprogram it as an SPDIF input. Now, lastly, of course, the I2S input, which you saw. I2S, if you're not familiar, if you think SPDIF has two things that has to be transmitted through it: the actual data and the clock signal from the digital data to decide, so the devices know, the speed of the data coming through. Now, when you normally, in a normal DAC, the SPDIF input is split into the word clock signal and the data, and of course now they're split externally here, but often now people have been using I2S, which is the internal connection for the split data and word clock to connect components, and they've been using it with external connectors such as this HDMI connector or the RJ45 used for networking. And now the problem is there's no solid standard for this, so the pinouts can be a little bit variable. So things like the SU1 there have jumpers on the bottom, so I can program them to the correct pinout for the Audio-gd, or you can actually order it with the correct pinout for whatever device you want to connect it to. But I'll talk about that in the sound impressions, the USB, for example, versus the I2S input. Lastly, there's one more input, and that is an XLR analog input. So if you want to connect another DAC, and I have the Yggdrasil sitting just above, or some other things like the Chord gear, which are just out of view, then I can do that. But there isn't an RCA input, only XLR. So if you have something like a Chord Qtist, well, it's not going to be usable as an input, but it's there all the same. But next to those are the outputs, and this is where I've customized things a little bit. Two of the outputs are fairly straightforward. That's your RCA single-ended and your XLR output. But there's one more called ACSS. Now this normally uses a mini 3-pin XLR output, but I've had it customized to what some of the older master components use, which is a 4-pin XLR.
Now the reason for doing this is because I like to make my own cables, and if I want to make a long cable run, it is an absolute pain in the butt to use tiny plugs and sockets and those kinds of things. So what I've done is I've ordered the larger old school sockets, and that means I can use the nice high quality cable and connect those. Or I could have had them customized just a 3-pin XLR, but a lot of Audio-gd gear has been using, such as the Master 9 just out of view below me, has actually an output for ACSS, which uses the same 4-pin XLR connector. Now, what is this ACSS? Well, anyway, Audio-gd components use a current gain stage for amplification. Now, normal amplification is done by a voltage. The disadvantage of voltage is each component, which you pass a voltage signal through, will not only pass the signal through, but a little bit of noise. So using current gain potentially can lower that amount of noise by using the fluctuation of current instead of the fluctuation of voltage to transmit the signal. The problem is when you're connecting another component, then you have to have a conversion from current back to voltage for the output to these. So what happens is with the Audio-gd components, by using ACSS, they can connect the current gain stages and bypass first the current to voltage output of the DAC, for example, and then the voltage to current conversion of the amp. So that means you can connect the amplification circuits together with lower distortion potentially. And that's what I've done here down to the Master 10. So that's a very handy feature there if you're buying all Audio-gd components, and goes back to, if you're buying separates versus buying an all-in-one, whereas the ACSS connection will be internal. So anyway, let's get on to the front of the R-27HE and, well, the functionality, which includes the ability to upgrade the firmware.
Where things have gotten interesting is inside there's actually a menu system with 9 options in here. So, there's a remote control, and it doesn't access actually the menu system. The remote control, incidentally, is the same remote control that you get with a Master 10 or a Master 9 or basically anything, unless you get the little small plastic one. Maybe not as sophisticated as some and maybe a bit simpler than others. It's not, at least I suppose it's more sophisticated looking than the kind of basic plastic generic things you get with topping an SMSL. But anyway, it has this volume control, and one of the nice things is the volume control used to only allow a single step of movement, but now it will ramp as you hold the button down, which is the priority with Audio-gd and companies like it is sound quality, and that's a typical thing in China. Sound quality above everything else. Functionality, convenience, everything else, sound quality first. So, the setting button doesn't, well, I don't know if it actually does anything, but it just makes the whole thing flash. I've never worked out what it did, but you can also at least switch between the channels in it as well. But, the main functionality you have to access through this menu system, and as I said, there are 9 options. On the display you have your channel, your volume level out of 99, and the sample rate 384 because I've been upsampling to it, which I'll talk about in the sound impressions. Then if you press this, the right hand button just cycles through the inputs, but the left hand button will enter the menu system, and we'll go to the very beginning of that. It'll probably make more sense. You have headphone amp and preamp output, and that's fairly self-explanatory. You have low and high gain, and the interesting thing about this is I've used it in low gain and never, even with the Susvaras, reached 99. The highest I've reached, I think, is 91 with the Susvaras, and yeah, that's about it. Maybe with some very quiet classical you might go higher, but really the gain levels, they're set pretty high. Obviously, I've never had to use the other ones, although in preamp mode, maybe for some gear it might be, the different levels might be useful. But of that, the gain levels, all they do is now this uses a volume control, a relay resistor of volume control. So it's a set of relays on a board, and they're switched in and out. On Audio-gd side, it shows how that the high gain just ramps up faster than the low gain, and that's all it is, really. Now, it's very confusing because some people think that gain level is related to power, and it's not. It's just how loud the amp is set to get. Some people will think that, they turn the volume a little bit and the sound gets loud quickly, that the amp has a lot of power. Nothing like that. Doesn't work like that at all. Next is whether the level of oversampling on there. Non-oversampling, there's 2 options there, which are kind of technically difficult to explain. There's 2 times oversampling, 4 and 8. And 8 is the default. If you're just not oversampling via other software, then you might just leave it on 8. As you go down towards non-oversampling, you lose filter accuracy, and the sound starts to kind of become a little bit more congested, kind of move towards the center, a little bit less accurate. Audibly less accurate, I should say. So that's something to consider there. And I tend to have it, because I've been using oversampling, I have it in non-oversampling mode. Lastly, we have, this is the DAC mode switch. It's in P mode, which is, it'll have volume control. You can also select 2, 4, 3, 4, or 5 volts of output if you want to have it in DAC mode. So this, because some equipment has different voltage requirements for input. If you just set it at the standard 4, it'll be too high for some gear, and maybe it might be a little bit low for some other gear. So it allows, if you want to use this just as a DAC to another amplifier which has its own volume control, you might want to be able to have a good volume range in there, so you can adjust that to some degree. It also, now most audio amplifiers, something like this GSX Mini above me, will have the volume control on the input. So that means it kind of irrelevant. Whether you just have comfortable volume range is the only relevant thing there. But things like Audio-gd gear, like Audio-gd amps, the volume control is actually, it acts as the converter from current to voltage. And that's because they use current gain stages and the output has to be voltage. The input is not volume controlled. So if you overload the input, you can actually overload the input and put too much power through. But you want as high an input as the input stage is capable of receiving, so that the signal to noise ratio is higher. So if you are just using this as a DAC to another Audio-gd amp, you might want to set it at the highest level that the amp will kind of accept. And this is only for voltage output. I don't think it doesn't affect the current stage output as far as I know. And if I'm wrong, I'll correct that in the description. Now, the other thing is you can have an external clock, which I talked about, and there's the option to select that there, and it will just error and just won't work. It just won't work if there's no external clock. This is a thing called vinyl mode, simulate vinyl mode, and I don't know what it does, and Kingwa won't say, but it does make the sound a little bit more I think it adds a little bit of even order harmonic distortion actually, and it's supposed to be used in non-oversampling mode ideally. Now I have it off because I'm doing my own oversampling. I don't need any more digital mucking about. So it's an option there for people who want to, have this, old school, like a very big and expensive old school kind of digital to analog converter, like the R2R11 that I reviewed before, which is non-oversampling and have that kind of sound. You do get a simulation of that as you turn the oversampling down. It ends up sounding more like an R2R11. The other thing, you can set the display to go off after a period of time. It'll just leave a single dot on screen to indicate that the display is, the power is still on. So you'll see after about, 10-20 seconds, I forget, that the display will just switch off and leave a little tiny dot on there. So waiting. It'll be there in a second. It's not too long. There we go. And there's still power dot. So turn that. I don't want that off. And lastly is a button that allows you to switch whether you have the sample rate on top and everything else and the volume and input on bottom. These 3 digits and those 3 digits you can swap around, and the sample rate. I prefer the other way around. Now, but the good thing is the display is large, and of course, if you have a lot of displays on gear, which are, use those really tiny displays with all the information, which is fine if it's on your desk. But if you've got this, say out in a rack and you're sitting back in your sofa, you can't read those displays. They're too tiny, unless you have the vision of a pilot or a hawk. The difficulty in evaluating something like the R27HE is that it is 2 components in one, and it has a lot of features. So to some degree, I split out my evaluation into just the headphone amplifier and just the DAC, not just comparing the whole device as it is to whole other devices, but kind of mixing and matching to see how the performance was affected by combining the components. So in that, let's start with the headphone amplifier. Now the headphone amplifier is a Audio-gd Master 9, albeit it won't have quite as many power supply components such as transformers and power supply groups as the dedicated Master 9 does. Likewise, I have a completely different kind of amp, Allo Audio Studio 6, to compare it with. So in that, I used the inbuilt DAC with the inbuilt R8 inside the R27HE and fed that to both of those and compared that to the inbuilt amp. Now the inbuilt amp in and of itself is enough for any kind of headphone that doesn't require a specialist amp. HiFiMan Susvaras and the latest Dan Clark Audio Stealth and Expanse, which are very demanding headphones, as well as these 2-ohm LCD-Rs, are driven very well by this amplifier. So they require headphones that require a lot of voltage swing or a lot of current are very well driven, even using movie soundtracks with very low bass. Now that makes the amp also a step up above the mid-range amps behind me, the ones that are about $500 to $700, because not only did I get better overall performance in that way, I also get better sense of depth to the music and a better sense of the subtle nuances such as instrument decay and the sounds of the notes kind of bouncing around the venue, that kind of micro detail that you get in music that makes it more pleasurable to listen to and brings the most out of headphones such as the Susvaras and the Dan Clark Audio Expanse and Stealth, was more present in the R27HE and consequently the Master 9. But speaking of the Master 9, it was a bit of a step above the inbuilt amp in the R27HE. So it was noticeable that the greater power supplies in the Master 9 compared to the ones in the R27HE gave even more breathing room and even more subtlety over the inbuilt amp in the main unit. Now, this wasn't a huge difference. I mean, I wouldn't spend an extra $1,300. If you were going to go down that route, you'd buy the separate components. But it showed that there was just a little bit of compromise in combining both the amp and the DAC into one unit. Now the DAC, on the other hand, I don't have another Audio-gd unit to directly compare to, but I do of course have the Chord TT2 and MScaler stack, and I have Schiit Audio's Yggdrasil Analog 2, which is now sold as the OG or original. And in that I plugged the Yggdrasil directly into the R27HE's XLR sockets to compare how the inbuilt DAC sounded. Now in that I found that the Yggdrasil sounds maybe just a touch drier. And it's hard to say it's a touch more neutral because it does have this odd slight mid-bass bump that you hear very occasionally in music. And it's a weird issue to do with the circuit and only shows up in the crosstalk measurements. But ignoring that, I would say that the general kind of sound, although it's a very subtle one, of the DAC in the R27HE, which is again an Audio-gd R8, is maybe a touch more on the warm side. Though, I mean, if you're comparing DACs and you didn't know what you were listening to, you wouldn't know specifically that it was an R2R DAC, except maybe in the fact that it doesn't have that kind of flatness that you get with some Sigma Delta DACs, or that kind of edginess that you do with some, say, ESS Tech-based DACs. So it certainly didn't sound as flat and kind of uninvolving as the topping D90 that's sitting above and behind me. The interesting thing though was that I'd not only evaluated the inbuilt settings, but I also evaluated external upsampling. So let's talk about the DAC and its performance. Now by default, it is set to 8x oversampling mode. Now if you turn off the oversampling, or you turn it down to say 4, 2, or 0, then what happens is the sound stage starts to collapse, things become more blurry, and it kind of ends up sounding much the same as, say, a Holo Audio May, which I heard recently, which, of course, in non-oversampling mode, I immediately recognize that kind of mode as, things sound kind of nice and smooth, but not so clear. And that's where, when you turn back on oversampling, the sound stage opens up, you get more clarity, you get more detail. But evaluating it through, say, level match, which I did through my speaker system using an Audio-gd Master 10, I tried it against the Chord TT2 and MScaler stack to see how much better that stack could do than the inbuilt R8 inside the R27HE. Now in that, I felt that the Chord stack brought out more nuance and more detail, even just the TT2 by itself. The Chord gear has a very accurate sound stage. You can hear very clearly and very evenly how far things are away from the microphones, how far in all directions. So it has the Chord gear has been designed very carefully to provide the most accurate soundstage in, well, 3 dimensions as possible. And the greater nuances available when I had both connected to the Master 10 were very apparent even on my kind of not too super amazing speaker system, which has a pair of floor standing LAC FS247s. What the Audio-gd did offer was, well, a little bit of a drier, a little bit less involving sound, but I managed to get around that with a little bit of trickery. Now, one of the first things I did is try to see how the USB input compared to, say, the I2S input. Now, I don't have the best digital-to-digital converters or the best setup, but I do have this Singer SU1, which I used the I2S output into the R27HE, and I fed it mainly with the iFi's Zen Stream, which separates, of course, my computer from the final processing of the digital data to minimize any effect that things like noise might have. Now, in that, I found that the I2S input was a little bit of a step above the USB input. There was a little bit kind of smoother, a little bit less kind of edgy. It was just generally a little bit better, but it wasn't as dramatic as using high quality upsampling. For that purpose, I used HQPlayer. Now, it's a very complex piece of software that can do an amazing array of things to the music, upsampling, PCM using dozens of different filters, and likewise DSD upsampling if required. And you can get amazing performance out of DACs if you do use this software, although it is kind of around $300 to buy it. So what I did is I used that through the Singstar SU1, through I2S into the R27HE, and compared it to the inbuilt filters. So I set the R27HE in non-oversampling mode and then used HQPlayer using the, if for the curious, the poly-sync-gauss intermediate phase filter ended up being my favorite. Now, don't worry if you don't know what the details of that filter are. HQPlayer does have a very steep learning curve, and it is kind of very difficult to learn, but once it's set up right, it can do amazing things. Now, in that, let me just jump back to the Chord for a second to explain a bit of perspective. Now, with the TT2 and MScaler, I keep feeling like I want the Dave again. The Dave just had that little bit of something extra that made you feel the music inside you. It went to another level where it feels like the music is actually coming out to you. You're not separated from the music. With the TT2 and MScaler, it's kind of maybe a little bit like something's slightly removed. Now, when I tried through my speaker system, I level matched the Chord TT2 MScaler system with the R27HE, both plugged into my Audio-gd Master 10. I found that with HQPlayer upsampling, I could get some of that feeling back through the R27HE, whereas the TT2 and MScaler had more ultra detail, like I could hear more fine details in the music, more of those, those subtle things such as instrument note decay, and again, how the sound bounces around the room. I felt that it was more enjoyable a lot of the time listening with the R27HE, either through speakers or actually through, say, the Studio 6. It just had more body to the music and more feeling to it using the HQPlayer upsampling. It was just more generally enjoyable to listen to. Now, that isn't to say that very precise system that you get from the TT2 and MScaler isn't, because sometimes I plug headphones directly into it, and the overwhelming amount of detail with a lot of music can be fantastic. But sometimes, it's like, well, I have a tube amp. Sometimes I don't want perfect. Sometimes perfect isn't what's necessary. And I found that the R27HE can deliver that with a little bit of tweaking. Now, it's not to say that isn't a common thing. A lot of Audio-gd owners, if you say look at the Headphone thread, do talk about things like external clocks and spending a lot of money on those, as I've already mentioned, and upsampling and which inputs and what digital-to-digital converters, DDCs as we call them, to use and all that kind of thing. Whereas the Chord gear is a little bit more set and forget, and about the most tweaking I have done is, say, on the MScaler, which can get a tiny bit of an improvement using a high quality power supply, whereas the TT2 is no difference at all because it uses supercapacitors. There's a bit of difference there. Kingwell of Audio-gd, he focuses on sound quality, and people tweaked his gear, so he improved his gear, and then people tweak it to improve it more, and then he improves that, and that's why you have better USB, better this, and you have the CPLDs for input instead of your standard kind of input SPDIF chips. You have all this programming. He's constantly working on improving stuff, and so that's kind of where it goes with the Audio-gd gear, whereas the Chord gear is like, this is what you get, and it's going to be that forever. And that's not necessarily a negative thing, because Rob Watts, of course, had a longer background in digital audio and has gone down a slightly different path with a particular focus. But to answer the final question, which I asked at the beginning, is do you buy separate components? What if you buy an all-in-one? What do you get or what don't you get? You may get a slight compromise over the sound of buying separate components, but as a solid all-in-one, which you could say is fairly, and I use this term that you often see on forums, the end game, where this is all you need in the end. I could very happily live with just an R27HE. If I wasn't a reviewer, I would very seriously consider just having this and kind of clearing off the rack. It does do an excellent job, and if you do go down the proverbial audio rabbit hole of tweaks and networking, streaming and all that kind of thing, and oversampling, you can push it above where it's at with an extra, it ends up being about $1,000 extra or thereabouts. and get even better results still. Now, of course, if you want to go full on, you have a rack, or you don't mind stacking gigantic things on your desk, you could go down the full HE9 and R7HE route and get an amazing system in that regard. So if you are considering buying a component such as the R27HE or separates, I hope this video gave you an idea of what the performance would be like. Now, of course, if you do already own an R27HE or Audio-gd components or the like, or maybe even other related components, do consider posting below in the comments with your experiences. That means people who are considering spending this amount of money don't just get my opinion, but get the opinions of actual customers as well. And that should hopefully help people make a better decision. But if you do want my buying advice and some help with buying gear, do consider becoming a supporter. It's because of my supporters that I'm able to make these videos. By becoming one, not only can I help you, but you can also help me, and everyone wins. You'll also get to see these reviews and my impressions of gear in advance and influence the kind of gear that I review. And I also have some audio guides for members and patrons, which you can view, which will hopefully help you make better decisions. So again, thanks to all my supporters. And if you aren't one, consider becoming one, and let's help each other out. So as always, I look forward to seeing you online.